Today we're going to be finishing off lesson 7.3 with part B. We're going to be looking at diagrams and determining which type of shape or quadrilateral that they are based on what is marked. The first question is multiple choice. Give the most precise description of the figure. So I want you to take a moment and look at what is marked and look at your answer choices. You will notice we have quadrilateral, which is not a parallelogram, and then the other three are the special parallelograms. So the first thing we want to remind ourselves is that we cannot base our decision on looks. We have to go by what is marked on the diagram, and that's it. You can't go by what you think it looks like, just by what you know to be true. So the first thing I noticed is that we have opposite angles that are congruent. So it is therefore a parallelogram. Remember, we had the 5 ways to prove parallelograms. One of those was if opposite angles are congruent. If you have 2 pairs of opposite congruent angles, then you know it's a parallelogram. So this is definitely a parallelogram. And all of the angles in that parallelogram are right angles. So a parallelogram with right angles is a rectangle. Can I go farther? Can I say it's a square? And the answer is I can't. There is nothing marked there about the 4 sides being the same, about diagonals bisecting the angles, about diagonals being perpendicular. Anything that would make it a rhombus as well would then we'd be able to say it's a square, but we have nothing else to mark except those right angles. That's it. So our final answer simply has to be B, the rectangle. I know it looks like a square. I'm aware of that, but it's not, because you can only go by what is marked on your figure. Determine whether the parallelogram is a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square. Explain. Now I'm going to tell you, I actually went a step further than that, and I just said this is a quadrilateral. So I actually proved it was a parallelogram as my first step, because a lot of times that is what you are asked to do. So let's start with letter A and take a look at what is marked. Well, I have opposite sides marked as congruent, 2 pairs of those, and 2 pairs of opposite angles marked as congruent. So I can use opposite sides or opposite angles being congruent to say it is a parallelogram. And I also see that all right angles are marked, meaning it is a rectangle. And all sides are marked as congruent. So it's also a rhombus, which means it is a square, because a rectangle and a rhombus are going to collect together to give us a square. I do want you to notice as I go through each of these things, you should be seeing a flow to your thinking. You identify the flow down the quadrilateral hierarchy. So you start at the top. Why is it a parallelogram? And then can you say it's a rhombus or a rectangle? And then can you go even farther and say it's a square? And you have to only use what's marked to be able to flow down the quadrilateral hierarchy, but make sure you're following your flow of thought. Let's move on to letter B. In letter B, noticing what we have marked, we have 2 pairs of opposite congruent sides. So it is a parallelogram. Then I see I have 1 right angle marked. Now that actually tells me a lot, because if 1 is a right angle, let me bring my cursor over here. If this one's a right angle, the one across from it or opposite it will be a right angle, because we know opposite angles are congruent. Then I also know that consecutive angles have to add to 180. So 180 minus this 90 leaves me with another 90. So this angle right here would be 90. And then this angle over here would be 90, because opposite angles are congruent. So I actually know that all of those would be right angles, and all right angles lead me to say it is a rectangle. I can't go any farther than that. It does not have any of the properties of a rhombus or a square. So we are finished in saying it's a rectangle. Again, notice the flow to thinking: parallelogram down to rectangle. And then let's move on lastly to letter C. So I see opposite sides marked as congruent, which 2 pairs of those, which means I do have a parallelogram. And because all 4 sides are congruent, it is a rhombus. I have nothing else that would tell me it's a square. So I have to stop at rhombus. Again, notice that downward flow of thinking about your shapes. Then I have two questions that are always, sometimes, and never questions. These tend to get a little tricky for people. I tried to do two easy ones just to kind of remind you about them. So a square is a rectangle. So think about the hierarchy and the flow chart. The square is at the bottom. You can't get to the square without flowing through the rectangle. So a square will always have to have those 90-degree angles of a rectangle. So a square is always a rectangle. You always flow down the flow chart, and if you flow through something to get to something underneath, it has to be an always. You have to flow through the rectangle to get to the square, so it's an always. The second one, I flip those around. A rectangle is a square. So now you got to think about where those fall in the hierarchy. There is a rectangle, but you don't flow through square to get there. You can go down from quadrilateral to parallelogram to rectangle and stop. So it does not have to be a square. So it's not an always, because you don't have to flow through it. If it's going to be a sometimes, then you have to be able to flow from that down to square. So can I flow from rectangle to square? Yes. So it's going to be a sometimes. If you can't flow to it, that's when you would put a never. A few people find check charts like this to be helpful. This one's got your properties over on the left side, and it has them organized by sides, angles, and diagonals. So that's one of those things. Maybe that's something you want to look at as a check chart. Here's another one. I like this one personally. It's a little easier for me to look at and use. But if you're going to use a check chart, what you're basically doing is you're saying, okay, what's marked on this diagram? And you find that information over here in the properties column. So is it marked that opposite sides are congruent? Okay, well, then it could be anything with a check mark. If it's marked that all sides are congruent, then your answer is either a rhombus or a square, only one of those two. So then you'd go back and you'd look at what else is marked on your diagram, and that's going to help you figure out whether it's, one or the other. So let's say we had a diagram where all sides are marked as congruent, so it's either a rhombus or a square, and we had the diagonals marked as congruent, so that's either a rectangle or a square. Well, I didn't say rhombus both times, and I didn't say rectangle both times. What I said both times was square. So that particular item or that particular figure would be a square. So you're going to be looking at some of those today and identifying what that shape is. Make sure you're specific. I always say be overly specific rather than vague. It's more important for me to have too much information than to have not enough information. So talk it through. Make sure you're giving me everything that I could possibly want to have or know. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.